So Drew has led the Connected Communities effort at Microsoft, which is one of the largest corporate communities of practice programs in the world, with over 60,000 members. And one of these was the Sustainability Community of Practice, which Drew was leading with over 10,000 members and 37 chapters around the world. So yeah, Drew, I'm going to ask you a few questions about your leadership of this community. Again, please, about 2 minutes per question if you can. And again, I might interrupt you in this way if we're leaning off track. So can you start by telling us what was the purpose of the Sustainability Community of Practice? Like, what was the purpose that members were united by? Who were the members? Why did they join and stay in service of this purpose?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me here. Great to be here with all of you, especially Bill, giving us millennials hope that not all boomers are hopelessly lost. But yeah, I mean, officially, the purpose of the community of practice was to grow sustainability knowledge in the workforce at Microsoft. Just like any other skill or discipline that can be learned, and obviously, sustainability is a rather large, complex topic with lots of subdisciplines and flavors. It was to, globbing onto the broader purpose of this communities of practice program to create a distributed network of employees so that you could have a place, an environment where peer-to-peer learning could happen to grow, in this case, the sustainability fluency of the workforce. Unofficially, the purpose of the community was to get Microsoft to get more serious about sustainability and put more resources into fighting climate change. And also unofficially, it was to give employees more power and influence inside the hierarchy of a corporate structure so that when it came to sustainability decision making, employees had a seat at the table so that, as David said, they weren't on the menu. Who were the members and why did they join? In the early days when we didn't really know what it was going to be, and long before it was 10,000 people and part of Microsoft's strategy, it was just like a scrappy group of people meeting up once a month trying to figure out how do we get the company to get more serious about sustainability? How do we get power and influence as random employees that don't have sustainability in our job titles? So the early members were what I like to call the super greens. They were the environmentalists who were hiding in plain sight in the company, who were already thinking the same thing and trying to figure out how they could use the resources of a big company to create climate solutions. As the community matured, and then for the first 2 years, it was all about putting pressure on the company from the inside, which was ultimately successful. Microsoft, now widely known as a corporate climate leader, really big, ambitious sustainability targets. Once that happened, the goal of the community really shifted from keep pressure on the company to do stuff that it's not doing to evangelize sustainability. And the mission of the community was make sustainability part of everybody's job. Because even in an organization like Microsoft, the total number of people who work on sustainability full time is less than 1%. And so the work of the community was how do you get that other 99% of the workforce, the critical mass of people, to find meaningful ways to look at the intersection of their job function, whether that's software engineer, financial analyst, program manager. How do you get those people to embed sustainability in the day-to-day work that they do down in the nooks and crannies with their teams, their managers, their processes? But really, it was about bringing more helping hands to a problem that was larger than any of us.
Yeah,
Yeah,
makes
I
sense.
think why did they join and stay? Because there are various reasons. Some people were just deeply concerned about climate change. Others were getting customer questions. Your average sales guy who's like doesn't know anything about net zero and his customers asking how Microsoft can help. The community
Mhm.
is a place you could come. There's a buffet. You could get anything you needed there.
Yeah. Very, very cool. And yeah, by the way, you mentioned less than 1% of full-time sustainability staff. That actually seems extraordinarily large compared to some other companies. Many of the companies that are very serious about it have like 0.1%, and they
Yeah.
integrate it better. So yeah, I would love to dive deeper into how the community worked. So what were some of the specific ways in which members could engage with each other or with the shared purpose of the community? How did you get them to keep doing that, and how did you approach lurkers?
Always the lurkers. Well, I guess if I broke it down into two categories of the ways that members could engage, it was either synchronously or asynchronously. So asynchronously, obviously it's Microsoft, so we're using Microsoft products. So we had a Teams channel. That was the sustainability community. And then because Teams allows you to have sub channels, we were able to create channels for the kind of segmentation that you would want. So as you mentioned in my intro, there ended up being more than 40 chapters around the world, right? So a single global employee sustainability community, just one place to go, one membership to join. But within that, a sort of franchise model of local chapters, because people in Singapore wanted to work on different things than people in Seattle. So asynchronously, people used, these hyperscale platforms like Work on Climate uses Slack to talk to each other about whatever you're interested in whenever you want. It's an always on conversation forum, right? And we did the best we could to make it easy to figure out where to go to have that, conversation. So you want to talk about circular economy? There's a dedicated place for that. You want to talk about home sustainability and how you can create pollinator gardens, you can go over here. You want to learn about scope 3 over here. So enough segmentation, enough variety, very similar to what Work on Climate does, to where there's something for everyone, but also you haven't created so many places that it's impossible to figure out where to go. And then synchronously, again, those local chapters would schedule in-person meetups. That could be something like a volunteer tree planting event in your local community. It could also be working with your local stakeholders on the ground in your subsidiary office. Mostly people worked around waste reduction and trying to get single-use plastics out of those cafeterias and cafes in the local Microsoft buildings. So it was kind of a hybrid approach of like, there's just one community. We have these events. Some are in person, many are remote, lots of webinars, just like Work on Climate. But we really tried to meet people where they were at, knowing that some people are super greens. They're going to dial into every single thing. They're going to watch every recorded thing that we put into the learning library. Some people are just going to lurk and occasionally post on a Friday when they have a few extra minutes. So we tried to create um, an opportunity for everyone, depending on your interest, your geography, your relative knowledge about sustainability, whether you're just climate curious or like a subject matter expert, something for everyone. And with lurkers, in the beginning, we would take sort of directed efforts to kind of like stimulate conversation and role model that behavior that we want to see is like the purpose of a community of practice, unlike an employee resource group, is to grow knowledge about a topic. That only happens if you ask questions and people provide answers. So there's some cultural stuff there, right? A lot of people aren't comfortable saying, here's something I don't know in front of thousands of strangers. So you had to create some of that psychological safety, role model that behavior. Hey, it's okay. We're all learning. This is really complicated. None of us are experts. Everyone benefits when you see that exchange. So eventually, we stopped worrying about lurkers because the community engagement was so high, both in terms of quantity and quality. The types of conversations that were happening, it was actually really beautiful to watch over the 5 years. You could see the sophistication of conversation grow exponentially because year one is like, why don't we have solar panels on the roof of every Microsoft building? To which there's actually a very good answer. To year five, as people are like, yeah, but scope 3, category 7, shouldn't that include this? And like, you could see the maturity, of those conversations progress. And that was because we created a place. And so we stopped worrying about lurkers because it was like, maybe you're getting something beneficial from this. You just don't want to post about it. So, anyways.
Very cool. Thank you. And you mentioned that some people were certainly a lot more engaged than others. I wonder, like, what types of leadership did people exercise, and how did you cultivate this leadership to make sure that more people really step up?
Yeah, well, I guess in like organizational psych terms, we had transformational leadership. Some of it was democratic, the inner workings of the sustainability community leadership team, which were very analogous to the way Work on Climate does it. You've got roughly 50, volunteers who own programs and have a lot of autonomy and agency within that structure to run those things as they see fit. There was a lot of sort of democratic leadership style in there. Also a lot of charismatic leadership, right? Like some people were like, I'm the green 401k guy. That's what I'm going to be known for. That's my crusade. I'm going to the mat for that one. And or enabled emissions. Many of you know the work that my colleagues Holly and Will did to try to get Microsoft to stop giving technology to fossil fuel companies for extraction. So a combination, again, kind of a buffet. It's like anything goes here. And some people are very introverted and very quiet. And so their leadership style is less out in the open, but
Hmm.
no less important, right? Like
Hmm.
they played a more kind of operational or internal role. And
Hmm.
other people, like those of us who led the community, were the face of it. We were the ones who were managing all the relationships with the chief sustainability officer and the other executives, making sure that the community's efforts were aligned to the companies, making sure we got our budget, got our headcount, maintained that seat at the table. So a little bit of everything. But what we ultimately tried to do was create an environment where anybody that wanted to could develop leadership skills. And
Mhm.
that was one of the ways that we kind of unlocked this flywheel of endless volunteer participation was tying participation in a community leadership role to your professional development goals, right? So your manager has goals for you, whether that's maybe you want to become a people manager, maybe you want to learn how to do some other skill. We made sure that we there was two ways to participate in the community as a volunteer leader. You could use an existing skill that you already had to great effect. We needed all of it. Or if you wanted to develop a new skill, we would create an opportunity for you to get to practice that so that it would directly benefit your own career, your own professional development.
Really interesting. So you actually actively create the new opportunities for people
Yes,
rather than just looking for people to fill specific gaps.
yes, both. It was both,
Great.
right?
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
there's a bunch of stuff that has ostensibly nothing to do with climate, but we actually need it, right? So like web
Hmm.
design. We had an internal website for the sustainability community. That was the homepage. That's where you could learn what's the mission, what's the structure, why does it exist, how does it I'm not a web designer. So great. You know how to build websites? We need you to do that. But then also people would come to us and go, I want to learn how to do XYZ. And we go, great.
Hmm.
We can build whatever we want. That's the beauty of doing this kind of bottom up grassroots employee community is like it's operating like a small startup inside of a giant, corporate monolith.
Hmm.
So we can invent whatever we want and build it for you and then try for 6 months and see what happens.
Yeah. Very cool. And yeah, can you say a little bit more about the workings of the kind of core team that
Mhm.
operated the community? What activities were involved? Like what activities did you do? You mentioned some of these, like working with leadership to make sure it's staffed, but what else?
Yeah. Well, as the community evolved in size and sophistication and ultimately in influence inside Microsoft, we started to create programs, rinse and repeat programs. Look, and I can say this because I volunteered with Work on Climate for a year, and I know your kind of inner structure is very analogous to that, right? You've got programs like marketing or monthly calls or events or whatever, and then you have an endless rotating door of volunteers who come in and do it for a little while and then pass the baton to somebody else. So we also realized that there are limits to how effectively you can scale a distributed leadership model with volunteers. The sweet spot seemed to be around 50 to 60. After that, the locus of control gets too big and it gets too hard to herd all the cats in the same direction. So we had these programs that were mostly long-standing. So things like monthly community calls. Every single month, there was a single call that the entire community was invited to. And that was like, if you're only going to do one thing, go to that. But we also had educational opportunities with sustainability professionals. So you could learn about what is aqua farming, what is carbon sequestration. So there were people who ran those programs
Mhm.
continuously, typically for 6 months at a time. When they were in charge of it, it was like, this is yours. You own it. Iterate, improve, do what you think should be done differently. Ask for permission, not or ask for forgiveness, not permission. It was very much like you can just figure this out. Make this what you think it should be. By the
Mhm.
way, when you're done, document everything you did so that the next person coming up behind you isn't starting from scratch and we don't lose that sort of institutional knowledge as volunteers come and go.
Mhm.
So those community leaders had a lot of autonomy, a lot of flexibility, but also the support and structure that they needed to feel like they could do this work. So for Holly and I and the other folks who were like the leaders of the community at the top, we would also offer if your manager is not supportive of you doing this work, because ultimately it does require like 2 to 3 hours a week or whatever, come to us. We'll go talk to your manager if you're cool with that. And we'll explain to them why this is valuable, why the chief sustainability officer says employees are the center of our sustainability strategy, why, we would write things for people that they could generically use in their self performance reviews, where you could say, by participating a few hours a week in the sustainability community, I gain XYZ skill. So we tried to unblock people
Mhm.
and free their calendars and give them air cover so that they could do this work without having to answer questions like, why are you doing this?
Mhm. Yeah, very cool. Thank you, Drew. Last quick question. So, what kinds of impacts did this community of practice create for its members, and what kind of impacts did it create through the work of its members for Microsoft or out in the world? And versus, was there anything that you tried to create an impact, but turns out the community is just the wrong vehicle for creating that kind of impact?
Sure. Okay, so what kind of impacts did it create? We
Mhm.
created a peer-to-peer environment where anyone could go from climate curious to full-on climate entrepreneur in whatever flavor they were interested in.
Hmm.
So we created a place where people could learn about sustainability and then turn that knowledge into something meaningful using the resources of $1 trillion tech company.
Hmm.
I mean, it created a lot of impact. But if I could boil it down to one sentence, the number one thing that it did was it successfully changed the paradigm of who was allowed to work on sustainability. Prior to the existence of the community, the only people that were allowed to work on it were those who had it in their job title or job spec. Less than 1%, right? So we successfully changed that narrative and said, no, sustainability is part of everybody's job.
Hmm.
And to Microsoft's credit, they were super supportive of that idea.
Hmm.
Yeah, we were able to change a lot, but we ultimately ran into each and every limit of what you can get a for-profit corporation to do.
Hmm.
Because at the end of the day, they're willing to do certain things, but they're not willing to fundamentally change their business model of endless growth and extraction. And so we ran into those limits time and time again.
Hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Drew. And yeah, so thank you so much, Bill and David and Drew. This was incredibly information dense. It was like almost like, staring at the sun in terms of how much insight you all are giving.
Yeah, we've just heard a lot, Drew. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm curious, just right off the bat, if Nisha or Kevin, what were your first, what stood out to you from what Drew said?
The thing that struck me the most was your comment, Drew, about kind of coming up against the limits of, for-profit company. And I'd love to kind of, have you embellish on that a little bit more.
Sure. I
I can
mean, the
only
most
I can only imagine just because I know how involved Microsoft is with the oil and gas industry. So I imagine that's part of it, but there could be lots of others.
well, there's lots of things that we tried to get them to do that they ultimately wouldn't do, but and the work we call it enabled emissions. That work specifically around the ways that the company works with the fossil fuel industry was by far the most important and ultimately the most sort of demoralizing. In fact, my two colleagues who really pushed on this quit Microsoft last year very loudly, partially because after almost 6 years of trying to work in good faith with the company, they were tired of being misled and broken a trail of broken promises. And but it really does speak to the limits of what you can get a for-profit company to do when it comes to sustainability, right? Like for most companies, when you think about becoming more sustainable, there's the list of really cool, sexy stuff that you're not yet doing, but you're willing to do. Things like setting up a carbon program, But then there's the things that you're currently doing that you need to stop doing that are making things worse. And those are the kinds of things that companies are far less enthusiastic about talking about. And number one on that list for us, because Microsoft is the largest cloud provider to the fossil fuel industry, was getting them to, first of all, calculate the impact, right? Like it's actually not that hard from a carbon math perspective to calculate the impact that giving these companies cloud services and AI in particular for extraction, how many more emissions that creates.
Uh,
Because
it-
companies like Microsoft love to say you can't change what you can't measure. And we're like, okay, cool, then measure it.
uh,
Like you don't have to like celebrate that out in the public, but we should at least be able to quantify
did you work with OCP on that?
who's OCP.
Open Compute Project. So there's so I do high performance computing stuff with OCP, and it's people like Microsoft and Meta and others who want cheaper data centers. But there's a whole
The,
sustainability thread there.
the company may be working with OCP, but the kind of activism work that employees were doing was just us and the leadership of the company saying, look, we don't expect you to just stop working with the fossil fuel industry tomorrow, but you've got to set a timeline of when you're going to change the way or put some conditions in place for how you work with them, which the
Hmm.
company did ultimately do after a couple of years. It's linked in the article I sent you. They did put a condition on, which was we'll only work with fossil fuel companies that have a net zero commitment. Anyone who knows about net zero knows how squishy and easy that is. And there's no accountability, there's no timeline, there's no nothing.
Yeah.
There's no clear path of, okay, well, what happens if the company backtracks on that commitment? Are you still going to work with them? Which is obviously what's happening right now. So,
Hmm.
anyways, I don't want to
Yeah.
ramble too much, but yeah, we ran into the limits of what you can get a giant for-profit company to do time and time again. And the enabled
Yeah.
emissions work is just maybe the most prescient example, but not the only one.
I kind of worked on that as a more technical thing of like if we can reduce your power footprint, we can get more stuff into your data centers and you can make more money. So it's just like you play the efficiency angle things like, particularly with Microsoft, because their computers are everywhere, like in laptops, PCs, and things. You can say, well, why are you using a data center? Why don't you move your stuff out to the edge and power it on solar? Use other people's equipment. That'll save you money. So just can you reframe the problem a little bit?
I mean, their business model is data centers, so probably not.
It's not really. I mean, I'm familiar with Microsoft from way back, and I saw how they got into the data centers and sort of it fixed a bunch of issues with how their software works. But then you look at things like how their operating system works these days and the capabilities. And, there's a lot of people in Microsoft probably don't understand exactly what they have and how it works. I worked on a hardware team at Microsoft and I said, hey guys, you got all this virtualization stuff you could be using. And it's like, oh, we don't understand that, not doing it. So it's like, you know, I think there's a lot of opportunity to get companies like Microsoft to do more stuff, but they're there to make money. You just have to explain it in a way that's how they're going to make more money, and they'll be quite keen.
Yeah. Drew, I'm curious. I know that the two of us have talked about this a lot, but something that stood out to me when you were talking was the timeline that you said, in the beginning, people were talking about kind of more basic. They were having very basic conversations, and then 5 years later, people were having very intricate, more complex conversations. And I'm curious if, there's something beyond. Yeah, what would you attribute that increase in complexity of conversation? I mean, I hear you that you created the space and the container and the information for
Yeah.
people to learn, but I'm just curious how. I guess at Work on Climate, I'm realizing that creating the container and giving the information is not the only thing that helps accelerate
It's
complexity
just
of
the beginning, right?
conversation.
It's the floor, not the ceiling of what's possible. You have to make the place first.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really hard to distill that down, but it was like the cocktail of all the right ingredients, right? Like, first of all, Microsoft, for better and for worse, was right place, right time, right culture. This kind of idea that employees can self-organize, create a sustainability community, ask for more power and influence, ask for a seat at the table, that wouldn't work in every company. I know it doesn't. I know all of my colleagues across big tech who tried to do this in the same time frame and had far less success. So right place, right time, right culture, all of that stuff. The enabling conditions on the ground were right. But also, not to undersell us, a lot of hard work, like
Mhm.
hard ass work, organizing, community building, brokering power, building relationships with executives, all of that stuff. Even things like asking the company to create a sustainability training, right? Like most companies do not train their workforce on sustainability. So how do you expect your employees to understand what your commitments are and then figure out the unique way that they can contribute to it if you're not training them for it?
Yeah.
So it was also understanding what we could do bottom up grassroots on our own to create those enabling conditions where people could become more climate literate, but also understanding that there are certain things that can only come from top down. They need money, they need budget, they need headcount, they need official company permission, things like creating trainings. So we did everything we could to create an environment where you could learn about sustainability in whatever flavor you wanted. Again, whether it's carbon or waste or whatever. And so and then having a very, very vibrant, active space where people are asking questions, providing answers. They did have access to some subject matter expertise. That's, of course, the main ingredient, as you know, in a community of practice. People need access to expertise so those questions get answered. So it was a combination of all of those
Yeah.
ingredients where people could come to this community. It was their kind of on ramp into sustainability. And once they were in there, if they wanted to, there was more than enough opportunities out there to learn about sustainability. And so the sophistication of conversations grew proportionally.
I wonder if there is like the missing piece that I wonder that about Work on Climate is whether we have the ground to practice whatever people are learning. So what I imagine for you guys, you had this kind of like learning track, place where people can communicate and talk to each other, like you said, and it was very easy for people to then plug it into whatever work that they were doing. They had the playground to play with whatever they were learning and experimenting. So the ability to transfer the learning into action, I'm curious if that's something that you saw people doing?
Well, definitely, right? Like
Yeah.
green software engineer principles, green design principles. We had all these amazing examples of people who their job had nothing to do with sustainability, but they successfully used the community to find their peers, create working groups, and then distill a set of literal principles in some cases of like, okay, if you're going to write more sustainable code for energy efficiency, follow this checklist. I'm not convinced that that's actually what's holding work on climate back because most of your members do have a place to practice that.
Mm,
I think what might be, and obviously I've been noodling on this a lot as we've been having these conversations about the Learn Workplace Climate Action, COP, is like, I actually think that it's simpler than that and it's very tribal. At Microsoft, everyone was on the same team. For better and for worse, we all work for one company. In a community where you have thousands of people from thousands of different companies, there's less of a sense of like we're working towards the same thing for the same reason on the same team. And so that's really hard to solve, right? But like I think that's actually part of it is that you have people who are like
mhm.
there's not that sense of like shared identity that we're working towards the
I,
same
I
thing.
I would take you to task on that for Microsoft. I mean, I remember like cartoons of how the different companies were structured. Microsoft was one where the departments fought with each other for
Yeah, that was in the
stuff.
Ballmer era like 15 years
Yeah,
ago. I don't know if you
yeah.
worked there when Satya was there, but it's actually quite a different
It got
company.
better. Yeah, I mean, it got a lot better, but it's the problem is these large organizations, there isn't really, sort of that much sort of cross functionality stuff going on. It's hierarchical. People are doing their thing in their corner a lot of the time, and they don't really see how stuff interacts.
And that's
Um,
what the community did, was it created a connective tissue
mhm,
for people who worked in different geographies, different business groups, different every part of everything.
mhm,
They came
mhm,
together for the topic of sustainability and
mhm.
collaborated with people that they would never have interacted with in their day job. And that unlocked an amazing amount of
Yeah.
innovation.
Yeah. Okay, we are at time. Thank you, Drew, so much.
Sure thing.